And we're back.
I did everything right and they indicted me.
I have no idea what you said. What?
It's a Trump reference.
Okay.
Get on board.
No, I could not understand the words you were articulating.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, chapter 9. Trotsky quote.
Oh god, yeah. These ain't good quotes.
Nick is reading this one. Let me find.
There's a Lenin quote next to it as well, right?
Yeah, you want to read both?
Yes, they're both related. So Lenin, 1917. The whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of work and equality of pay. Trotsky, 1937. In a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation. The old principle, who does not work shall not eat, has been replaced by a new one, who does not obey shall not eat.
Yes. So, yeah, what are we talking about in this chapter?
Security and stuff.
Security,
right?
yes. So I have a lot of notes on this one.
This is a big theme.
So Hayek just comes out swinging for UBI.
Yeah.
He's like, UBI, socialized healthcare, insurance against disasters and stuff. And claims that this does not threaten individual liberty or competition. And now he does admit some difficulties, which are, how high a standard to guarantee people? And what about citizenship? So obviously if you have like a country where you get a bunch of social benefits just by existing there, you would have a lot of people from other countries just coming there for those benefits, right? Okay. Comments on that?
It was kind of funny how it was kind of worded. Like, it kind of took me a little while.
Page 90, do you want to look at it?
Yeah, sure. It took me a little while, but I was like, yeah, he's talking about UBI, right? So universal basic income, right?
Yeah. I think he talked about like the minimum means of subsistence or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, it's at least good that he admits the difficulties, right?
Mm-hmm. So he says, I think there's actually, there is no reason why in a society that has reached the general level of wealth which ours has attained, the first kind of security should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom. There are difficult questions about the precise standard which should thus be assured. There is particularly the important question whether those who thus rely on the community should indefinitely enjoy all of the same liberties as the rest. And there's a citation here, there's a footnote here which says, there are also serious problems of international relations which arise if mere citizenship of a country confers the right to a standard of living higher than elsewhere and which ought not to be dismissed too lightly. Back to the main text. An incautious handling of these questions might well cause serious and perhaps even dangerous political problems, but there can be no doubt that some minimum of food, shelter and clothing sufficient to preserve health and the capacity to work can be assured to everybody. Indeed, for a considerable part of the population of this country, this sort of security has long been achieved. So I was reading this and I was like, this motherfucker's talking about UBI, and I mean, at this point, like, UBI is like more of a technical like question than anything else, right? Well,
no, it's a moral question, I think, fundamentally.
But there's also like there's a really big question as to whether it's actually possible.
Well, that's the thing, right? How high of a standard should you guarantee people? So in Germany, we have something that's called Hartz IV, and it basically is that, right? If you can, as long as you can prove that you have in some capacity been looking for work, but you're still unemployed, you get a bunch of money from the government. Which is like, it's quite like a substantial sum to live comfortably. So like, what do you really mean by the like minimum means to like clothe yourself and stuff? Like, obviously, if that was actually like so little that it was like barely enough to clothe and feed yourself, you know, like this would just politically not look good. You know, you would have a lot of people like attacking this, like, it's like so little, like this is barbaric. How can you think these are like reasonable living? Like we always talk about what is a living wage, right?
Sure.
But then also, again, like, yeah, if it's that little, you could just like work like a shitty like minimum wage job somewhere and earn a lot more than probably those government benefits would give you.
Yeah, and so like I think the mainstream idea of UBI now is like, one of the mainstream ideas at least is, I mean, it's kind of like it's not enough to prevent you from working. It's not enough to not prevent you, but to disincentivize you from having some kind of work. But it's meant to kind of allow you to have some kind of savings and some kind of like personal safety net. But also, it's generally also argued like in tandem with a reduction in social welfare. That's like one of the core like what's the word, conditions that like a lot of people that some people that promote UBI say it's like,
would probably like the more Milton Friedman side of things, right?
Yeah. It's more like, which I disagree with. But again, I mean, the question of UBI is like, is this actually affordable? So I don't know. And what are you willing to sacrifice in order to have this thing exist? If it's the case that having private healthcare and also UBI is a possibility, would you choose that over the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, like, personally, I'm just really uninterested in this question because I'm not a utilitarian. I don't care if this provides utility or not. I oppose it on moral grounds of property rights. It's simply like,
yeah, right.
You don't get to have shit that's not yours. End of question. If that's not like, in this way I'm maybe a callous capitalist, but like if you can't survive, well, I do not give a shit. You can starve on the street, and I will say that.
I love being your friend.
You will like, in modern society, you would have to be so incredibly actively sabotaging yourself to get to that point. And I know a lot of it is drugs, and like people who are, you know, obviously like 90-something% of the homeless population is because they're fucking junkies. But you know, I think it's also unrealistic to say that there wouldn't be institutions in like a private market system that would not take care of these people. That'd be charities and NGOs and that kind of stuff, which already exists, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that's also not like that doesn't have to exist in libertarianism anyway, right?
It doesn't have to, no. But yeah, again, I'm just super uninterested in this question. I just don't care.
Yeah, I know you aren't.
Okay, so unless you want to add anything.
No, let's move on.
So he also poses a question of how to deal with waves of unemployment. Now, if he was a real Austrian economist, he would say that the reason why there is the business cycle to begin with, and there are waves of unemployment, is because the state creates artificial booms by overextending their government spending. But because he's not a real Austrian economist, he asked the question of how to deal with waves of unemployment. Now, this is a big thing. He has this like hate-love thing with Keynes. So Keynes obviously is kind of like a leftist economist. Like way out there for government spending and so on, saying that, you know, if there's government should always strive for full employment by employing like government policy.
Yeah.
So, you know, Hayek says, okay, one approach would be monetary policy, that is to manipulate the interest rate. Another approach is fiscal policy, that is to manipulate government spending. He says neither would endanger freedom, although fiscal policy is to be handled with care. Kind of like a little jab at Keynes, being like, I know what you're doing there, Keynes, with your anti-cyclical spending ideas. I'm not saying they would ruin us, but I don't think they're that great.
Yeah.
But he's not getting into the thick of it here.
What a sick burn.
Right. So Rothbard would here say that, you know, the kinds of libertarians who care about utility, or I guess in Hayek's view, competition, and not natural rights are no libertarians at all, because the distinctions of where to increase utility and where not are arbitrary. So yeah, with this whole like unemployment thing, like what he has this whole thing about the rule of law and no arbitrary laws and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But then he also comes out and says, "Oh yeah, but we can't have like fiscal policy to combat unemployment. Like how are you going to make rules about that which are not arbitrary? It's I don't know. It's kind of hard to conceive. Like how are you going to decide what percentage, like how much money we should spend to combat what unemployment? I don't know. Maybe he elaborates this in some other book, but I'm not super satisfied here."
There's other things that he talks about. So this chapter on security.
Yes.
One point which I thought was quite interesting, and definitely relates to our like study in Japan. It's about salary. He seems to be quite against like guaranteeing wage, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea. Like, he seems to say like, as soon as you start guaranteeing someone what they will receive for their position, rather than necessarily like the work that they do or their capacity, you inevitably like insulate them from other people that can do that job better. Or I mean, just more generally, and this speaks to what we were talking about earlier about what was it? I mean, any kind of like interference where it leads to unequal results elsewhere. And so like, you know, we see this like very, very clear-cut example in like Japan and in like Korea as well. South Korea, stratified employment, where like you have people they're employed full-time for specific roles, and then so there are people who would have that kind of job and there are people who work hourly. And you know, what is the solution to that? I mean, he doesn't seem to really like outline it, or maybe I kind of read over it, but
I don't think he criticizes like a company paying you a fixed salary, but he talks about, okay, well, I'm just gonna read my note on this one. So he says, security against, albeit undeserved and morally unjustified, losses of income, which are however inevitable in a competitive system, is calling for subjective standard of justice of what one deserves, unlike an objective justice based on one's results or one's efforts. So, quote, in any system which for the distribution of men between the different trades and occupations relies on their own choice, it is necessary that the remuneration in these trades should correspond to their usefulness to the other members of society, even if this should stand in no relation to their subjective merit. So now a current day example that I thought of was just like welders versus the gender study major, right? So you can get like a welding degree for like in like half a year or a couple of months in the US, and like the classic like welding, plumbing, and these people actually seem to earn quite a lot annually. Whereas if you go to college, amass a huge amount of debt, studying something that really no one will employ you for, it's like, yes, maybe you put more effort in. Maybe you're even smarter than the welder. But, you know, the point is that if you're not creating anything useful, if you're not creating anything of value to other members in society, you know, and this is kind of a Thomas Sowell quote that I'm going to like paraphrase here. It's like, an economy is not like a subjective moral authority handing out money to you based on your efforts, but you know, it is the mechanism on which the means of subsistence of millions of people depends. So like, yeah, it's tragic that some people don't get as much money as other people, even if they put more effort in. But that's really not the question. The question is, are you actually creating something of value that other people demand? And if that's not the case, then I'm sorry, but you're not really owed anything from the world, right? The world doesn't owe you anything because you put in effort or because you're smart.
Well, it's like the labor theory of value.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up.
You put effort into something doesn't necessarily mean that it's valuable. But I would also say that is kind of very contingent on, I mean, I think you would agree as well, it's very contingent on culture, and it's very contingent on how we perceive value. And
how do you mean?
It's like very unfortunate. You know, have you seen the meme of like, there's like, it's so bad, so stupid. There's like two like girls. One of them is like this kind of plain looking girl who she paints this very like beautiful like painting, and then next to her is this like tall like girl with like big boobs and like high heels and like cool hair, and she's like taking a selfie in front of like some shitty piece of work, and there's like a like counter comparing both of them, and the girl who's like attractive is getting loads of likes. And obviously they're not judging her on the implication is they're not judging her on the merit of her art, they're just judging her on this like superficial thing of how she looks.
Right, so value is kind of an explosive word to use because it implies that there's like a difference in quality. What I guess we mean to say is demand, right?
But it is more valued though, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, that's what I mean.
And that's why you would say it's more valuable, quote unquote. But like if you want to put it into less explosive terms to upset less people, you could say it's demand, not value, that is important.
Am I stupid or do I?
No, so like
no, I know. I get what you're saying for sure. But my main point is that I think a lot of people are dissatisfied by the fact that like it seems like that the common like the mainstream liked thing is something that's often so dog shit. You know, especially when it comes to things like the arts. Like
sure, but then again, like what is embedded in that view is that all these people, their opinions are wrong.
I know.
And my opinion is right.
I know.
So actually, I should be in charge of who gets what.
I never said that anyone
I know.
Get anything. But
I know.
It is like it's hard to see things that you think are really profound, and to see them being completely overlooked. Anyway.
Right, so he says, security against job/income loss. This is my notes, not his words. Security against job income loss due to business cycle, innovation, etc. cannot be guaranteed to all. And its granting to particular groups only increases the demands for such security by others. So in here we have kind of a critique of crony capitalism, I would say, right? So this whole too big to fail thing, or really where we're saying like because it's a bank or because it's XYZ in Germany, it's the big automakers like Volkswagen. When they went bankrupt, it's like we're gonna have to use all the taxpayer money to rescue them. Yeah, because they're so vital to our economy, whatever.
Which is Keynes as well, right?
Yes. So it's really to say that. These kind of cyclical business cycle or due to technology innovations, these kind of losses of employment or income, they're tragic, and they're not. It doesn't mean that you're at fault necessarily, but we cannot guarantee these to everyone. And if we just guarantee them to some, that simply means that now, like, the relative security that these people get is bigger than the security that other people get, from whom the funds were withdrawn, right? If you save Volkswagen for a couple, $1 billion, then obviously like that was taken from someone, the taxpayer. And so now these people are less secure.
Yeah.
So what we find, and this is kind of one of the mechanisms of the road to serfdom, is that as socialism or planning gives these benefits to certain groups, the relative position of other groups is jeopardized. So now there's now more demand for this kind of pork barrel lobbying of, but I also need this thing. And this is how this road to serfdom accelerates, right?
And which is why these like there's such an emphasis with the rule of law on like trust and predictability and like understanding what the government's capable of doing. Cool. I see in this dictatorship of the good, quote, staring me down. We're getting there. We're getting there, baby.
Right. So one thing I thought on this point, though, is, so he says, and if it being perfect security, is provided for some, it becomes a privilege at the expense of others, whose security is thereby necessarily diminished. So I was thinking, well, doesn't this also apply to health insurance?
Oh, yeah.
Which he was, like, making excuses for. Or not, but he was like, oh, this doesn't necessarily diminish competition. But if, like, health insurance, or, like, disaster insurance, right?
The more people that are on health insurance, the cheaper it is for everyone, right?
Well, it's like the lottery principle of, like, you know, you might get, like, a super expensive disease that will take a lot of money to cure.
Mm-hmm.
Same as, like, oh, this big company might fail. So we should, like, in the health insurance example, he's like, we should help this person with everyone else's money. But you
mean like nationalized health?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But in the
national insurance,
in the like company fails example, or like someone loses their job example, he would say, no, we can't insure this.
Yeah. Well, I think that they would. I don't know. Like, I'm much more sympathetic to, like, bailing out an individual for something that is
sure, but that's on an emotional basis, right? This is, like, on the principle that it, like, gives someone a, like, certain economic, like, the criticism that someone now got resources that they weren't necessarily entitled to is the same in both cases now. Like, that this person now benefited from a kind of security that, you know, other people didn't get, or, like, they would only get if they also got that illness, I guess.
But the fact that they would also get that if they had the illness is the whole point, right? Like, which is why it's a good thing.
But okay,
because it's like, oh, I'm so angry that guy got cancer surgery and I don't have cancer, and it's like, oh, I now have cancer, and it's like, thank God I can also get the same treatment.
But the same could go for, like, if a company fails.
Yeah, but I mean, like, we're talking about such a grand, like, huge difference in scale of, like, how much it would cost to treat someone for cancer versus how much it would cost to, like, bail out a company or a bank, right?
But if you look at, like, government expenditure, the healthcare system is one of the most expensive things, much more than, like, what is being spent on corporate bailouts.
Well, living is more of an essential thing than having a company.
But companies provide the means of subsistence. Like, if you don't have a job, or, like, I don't know.
But I mean, I feel
human
life is still.
Again, these are all, like, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but these are going to be, like, emotional arguments, not.
I mean, human life is,
or, like,
still more
based on empathy or, like, subjective value, more so than, like, his criticism that, like, there is now an imbalance in the security that was provided and, like, taken from someone else. Like, funds were being taken from, like, this. The same thing still applies in my mind. I guess where I would spot the difference.
I think it doesn't apply, but because whether you are being a human does not necessitate owning a company, but having health problems is, like, an intrinsic part of being human, and it's something that's basically unavoidable.
No, I get that point, but we're saying if like, you lose your job, Hayek says you should not get security from government.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have the means to eat, or you might starve, I don't know, you'll live on UBI, I guess. But, but, like, you shouldn't be guaranteed to keep your standard of living.
Yeah.
Because this person would now get, like, a security based on funds that were taken from someone else, and thereby diminish their security. And, like, you can say that, like, with the cancer thing, it's like, yeah, but if someone else got cancer, they would also get it. But in the same way, we can say, oh, but if someone else lost their job, they would also get this benefit. I guess the difference is that in the cancer example, like, you cannot actually consciously be like, I'm gonna get cancer and I'm gonna get this money.
I'm gonna
whereas in the
find a way to keep the microwave door
open.
Right.
Whereas in the losing your job example, you can very much be like, I'm just going to lose my job and live on the government money.
No, because I mean, you would get people who would, because you hear the arguments all the time against the NHS. It's like, oh, it promotes people to like just sit around eating crisps all day and shit.
Smoke and drink.
Yeah, so I mean, there are people who would argue for that.
I don't think they're super convincing arguments, but yeah.
One thing I would say is that being employed is not an intrinsic part of like living, but having health problems, having health is.
Sure, but how are you gonna like pay for your food and shit if you don't have a job?
Well, it like if you're a kid, like for example, like you can still get food. I don't know.
Tell your body.
But it's also not. I mean, it's you're also. There's nothing about Hayek's like philosophy that needs you to have a job, right? You can just like live on your own farm and make your own shit and whatever. There's nothing that prevents people from doing that.
Sure.
It is different, right? Like you've got to admit that like health problems are far more inevitable.
No, I agree that there's a difference. I just think that the criticism that he gives in the book about losing your job, that same criticism also applies to the health problems. There is a difference, but I don't think the criticism he gives accounts for that difference.
Okay.
Like what you're saying makes sense to me, but he doesn't say that.
Okay, maybe
he just says that now some guy got security while someone didn't.
Right.
Same thing applies to healthcare.
And he doesn't give any caveats for for healthcare.
Right.
Okay.
But I do see your point. And it is different.
Maybe it's maybe something that he would argue, and if he's also like in favor of UBI, it would probably make more sense why he wouldn't be like you need guarantee of wage, whatever.
Okay, good point though. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. What does he say? Perfect security warrants authority to arbitrarily decide remuneration based on what one should have done, should have foreseen, and how good one's intentions were. Yeah, this is kind of a good point. Like, you can't with like ensuring your standard of living if you lose your job and stuff. You know, if you want to actually legislate that, there is going to be some point where some government body is going to judge, like, what could you have done? What should you have done?
Right.
What were your intentions in doing this? Did you lose your job on purpose?
What kind of standard of living do you want to continue to have?
Like, are you actually entitled to get this money? Yeah. So it will be like a subjective thing where government will subjectively judge your merits. Okay. Right. And then we have like the whole price mechanism argument. So the price of labor, that is wages, for different occupations, functions as a yardstick for people to judge the usefulness of that occupation to society. So in absence of the competitive system, planners will have much more difficulty in determining wages and quantity demanded of labor.
Right.
So yeah, this is just like technical arguments, planning. Right. He says, military service may be the best opportunity for the state to provide minimum insurance, minimum income and opportunity for work to all. So this, maybe not UBI, but if you can just guarantee employment in the military, right?
Yeah, it's quite a funny idea, and I guess we kind of do have it in some countries.
Right. I guess to counter that, and I know Peterson brings this up, and a lot of people bring this up, but the U.S. military does have like an aptitude test that is highly correlated with IQ.
Right.
And if you basically calculate the minimum score required from the aptitude test, it translates to an IQ about 83, saying that if you're in the bottom 10th percentile of the IQ distribution, you are not legally to be employed in the military because you are quote unquote too stupid to be useful.
Right.
And so obviously, without like being super fucking elitist, but like if you're at the point where you
being elitist,
if you're at the point, I'm fucking poor, dude. I have like $200 in my account.
No correlation.
If you if you're at the point where you cannot find any means of subsistence in the free market, and you're like, you have to rely on government handouts, chances are you are in the lower half of the IQ distribution.
Okay.
So this argument that we can just employ everyone who doesn't get a job, like in the real economy, in the military, and like, it's just, I mean, it's not theoretically impossible, but like current policy seems to contradict it, and then you would have like a military full of like the stupidest people in the country.
Well, it's also maybe not even necessary either. And I don't know, when I was reading that, I wasn't thinking necessarily this is like a whole, like a catch-all for every single person, but rather like, yeah, I do take your point. Like, if there is some kind of barrier to entry, then it kind of defeats the point. But, yeah, I mean, if there are people who would not be able to work in any other job anyway, I don't know.
But I do think like, if you want to talk about minimum means of of subsistence more so than UBI, giving them some kind of like civil servant type job is a better idea.
Well, we see a parallel in Japan with like people who are like much older, people who are retired. And there's obviously different scenario, but there's many jobs kind of that are almost specifically tailored for people who are retired, like just working like some security desk for like an apartment or whatever, or like helping to pack bags in the grocery store, like jobs that aren't like people who are retired who still kind of want to do something with themselves and make a little bit of money on the side to help with their pension.
So one thing, source my dad. My dad told me, who, by the way, is like a reasonable leftist.
Yeah.
In favor of minimum wage, actually, but like he would talk about how after the war in Germany, when he grew up, there were obviously a lot of cripples from the war, both physically and mentally.
Yeah.
And the way these people were integrated into society is that they would get like a very low paying job as like gardeners for the city garden. Like they would like clean up the public shrubbery and like collect garbage and stuff. But as minimum wage laws, increased, all those people like completely vanished from public life, and now they're put in like institutions where they're like put away to rot, like away from society, right?
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about how to give like minimum means of subsistence, that would be like something that I would be more inclined to favor.
Yeah, it's about giving the freedom, right, to decide how you want to spend your time. Like if you want to if you want to spend your time doing something that's like so has some kind of like social benefit, some kind of like psychological benefit, some kind of like physical benefit, and you can make money at the same time, having that option is good. I think most people kind of feel a lot of people feel a bit kind of squeamish about the idea of giving people less money, because when it boils down to it, essentially they don't have the physical or mental like capacity to do the same kind of work as someone else, and yeah, I kind of sympathize with that. There's something which just feels a bit kind of like, I guess, weird about it, but at the same time, it's like you will not convince a company except out of like their own like sense of altruism to pay someone more than they think they're worth, right? Which is like the bottom line, I think.
Well, not a small business, but big business certainly, because now it's all about ESG scores and inclusivity and blah blah blah. So like, I was going to bring this up later as well. Okay, let's save it for later.
I was speaking more in terms of like a strictly like no policy, no kind of like incentives. A company like the bottom line, like cold hard, like calculation would be like that this person is not worth earning the same amount of money as someone else who doesn't have like physical.
Well, it's not necessarily what is this person worth, but is like what is the value that their labor is creating.
Yeah, that's more. Yeah, sure.
And that's what Hayek talks about. Is like the way you phrase it, intentionally or not, would be the subjective way, and the way I phrase it would be the objective way. What is the value that is created versus what is this person? What is this person's labor worth? Right. And like if you take the first approach, like you necessitate a government which like judges people's remuneration based on their like personal merit.
Okay.
And so he's saying that's not somewhere where you want to live.
Right.
Okay. In a free society, few would be willing to purchase perfect security at its high price. However, over generations, the granting of partial securities to some interest groups increases the demand for security from others, as they are now less secure. Okay, we talked about this. Right?
Mm-hmm. There was one thing you talked about, like the social striving for security. You kind of seem to sort of lament this idea that like people strive for security rather than like freedom, which is something that I kind of sympathize with. I think I kind of agree with like seeking like, we want a salary, we want like all these like to be participate on all these institutions that will lend us stability, whether it's like having house insurance or pension or whatever, and the sacrifices of personal freedom that come with that like long-term assessment of your life. And he talks about how something to the effect of like people only want partners who have security as well, which I thought was quite like an interesting like idea. I mean, we see it everywhere, obviously, like the idea of like settling down with someone, having someone who's stable and secure.
I'm going to talk about that more in where he talks about like the socialist German evolution of things. But you touch upon a good point there, yeah.
I mean, it speaks to like the cultural like dimension to this whole thing.
Yes. There was a good Lord Acton quote somewhere here, which I forgot.
Oh, I have it here. It's the power tends to corrupt.
No. It's like if you're willing to give up like a little freedom for some security, you're not like okay, I'm just gonna go on. Okay. So this resonated with me quite a bit. So he talks about the kind of anti-capitalist propaganda in universities in the 1940s in the UK, where like basically like culturally it was viewed, okay, quote, to employ 100 people is represented as exploitation, but to command the same number as honorable. Yeah, deep cut. Bismarck, state, Japan, civil service, blah blah. Like I don't know, this glorification of bureaucrats, while at the same time like, yeah, capitalism is exploitation. It's so silly on its face. Like this goes back to this whole like freedom from what thing? Freedom from coercion, freedom from the means, blah blah blah. But like, like it just seems so intellectually disingenuous. And this doesn't mean that you cannot say that whatever, you're employing this person below a living wage, whatever. But, like, you can't at the same time glorify state bureaucracy while also, like, chastising capitalism for being exploitative, right? Like, clearly, if you employ 100 people voluntarily, whatever Marxist tools you want to use to say, like, oh, but they're not really voluntarily, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
Like, surely the guy who is commanding people, like, by order is not, like, the more amazing guy.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Right. So, yeah, Germany had already been a Beamtenstaat. This is very, very common word. Beamtenstaat, it means, like, the civil servant state. So this is, like, the Bismarck Prussian ideal.
Okay.
And I think we see a lot of this in Japan because Japan modeled their legal system after Prussia a lot.
Really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, but so yeah, all spheres of life, income and status are assigned by authority. People regard themselves as functionaries of the government, not as independents. So yeah, this would be like a big reason for why socialism, National Socialism, was so easy to develop in Germany compared to anywhere else, because Bismarck laid a lot of the foundations with his like very bureaucratic, state-oriented Prussia.
Right.
Where like if you are anyone in civil society, you're like a bureaucrat appointed, you know, and we have this to some extent in Japan still, I would say. With
quite
the
strong
Komuinshiken and so on, right?
Yeah,
well, I guess the difference in Japan is that like being a CEO is also venerated. It's not necessarily like in general, like in modern Japanese culture, people admire merit, they admire status, they admire effort.
Yeah.
So that can be both as a bureaucrat or as a private entrepreneur, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's both, but right. It's definitely like, getting a job in the service as a bureaucrat is super, super, super highly prized. And it's also quite hard to do as well, I think.
Yeah, there's all these exams and shit.
Really
yeah. Whereas like in Germany at the time, it was like very much like, like how did Germany come to view that liberty without security is not worth having? Quote, while it is doubtful, sacrifice... What the fuck did I write in here? Bro, I don't know what I wrote down. Anyway, he talks about how like Germany at the time valued civil servancy while it like denounced entrepreneurship, independent, like kind of, what you would call exploitation and so on, capitalist exploitation.
It's funny when you think about like the late Soviet Union and like the double society thing they talk about with like the bureaucracy that's functionally completely separate from like the rest of society and has its own interests, and it to the extent where like being a bureaucrat could maybe even be seen as like an entrepreneurial thing, because it's like you got into this system, you trying to find ways of like getting as much out of it as you can, and there's probably a kind of some kind of respect that's conferred from that. If anything, like if you know someone who's in the bureaucracy, you're like, oh bro, sort me out, like sort me out with the good stuff.
Actually, fair enough, yeah. That's good.
It's just a different, bit of colour.
But thinking about this, I think there's a relic of this today in Germany for sure, which is that we have this system of so the I would say English American university system is you like major in economics, you major in I don't know, like literature, like medicine.
Yeah.
The things you major in both in university as well as like senmongakko, which is what like vocational school.
Yeah, vocational school. Technical college.
Yeah, they're fairly general, and like you major in economics and you can be employed in a bunch of different positions later. In Germany, from like 5th grade, we are drilled so hard. Like they give us like the whole manual of like 2,000 something vocations, and like
Germany's got no chill.
I know, and like, and it's the same with like majors in university.
Right.
You pick like a super specific thing. It's like state accredited. That's like the whole thing about security in Germany, right? Like, you become the guy who fills the gold part of the teeth in dentistry. That's like what you become. That's what you study for, and then you get like the security of you will get this job. Like there's pretty much no chance that you're not going to get this job.
Right.
And like it's very much a like state oriented accreditation thing of security, which is like the German like education system majors. They're so hyper specific. It's insane.
Right.
And at the same time, in modern America, you would say like English literature, gender studies. Those are kind of looked down upon as like majors where you won't get a job, right?
Yeah.
You know what? The one like from like a very, very young age, as long as I can remember, the one specific university major that is so denounced publicly, constantly, for being too many people do this, you won't get a job, it's too general, there's no security. Guess what it is?
Come farmer. What?
Business administration.
Huh.
This is the one thing that, as long as it's like
sports science.
no, business administration. And this will get later. We talk about this whole like English capitalism versus German like organization, but yeah, this like looking down on the commercial like
okay, I see what you're saying.
And it made no sense to me when I came like to a different country like Japan, or even like traveling abroad and somewhere else, like why in Germany do we hate business administration so much? Right. Like if you get like an MBA in the US, you're set, you know.
Yeah.
It's like in Germany, it's like, oh, what did you study business administration? Ha ha ha.
That's funny. Yeah, it's kind of similar in the UK, I think. I remember making fun of people who are doing business studies and stuff.
That's your socialist upbringing. Anyway, chapter 10, if you want.
Yeah, let's do it. So we start with the Lord Acton quote. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Strong quote.
That guy seems cool.
Yeah. So, we have a lot of talk about totalitarianism now.
So the first thing I wrote down is Hayek rejects the notion that totalitarianism can work as long as the dictator is a quote-unquote good guy. Page 101.
As long as he is a good guy.
So he basically denies quote-unquote good totalitarianism.
Okay.
I think this whole chapter he talks about why that's not a thing.
I was confused though, because he does talk. I mean, the main thing is about how totalitarianism is bad. But he has this quote here. He says, "We must not deceive ourselves into believing that all good people must be democrats or will necessarily wish to have a share in the government. Many, no doubt, would rather entrust it to somebody whom they think more competent. Although this might be unwise, there is nothing bad or dishonorable in approving a dictatorship of the good."
Right, so he's talking about voters.
What does that mean?
He's talking about voters. So he's saying...
someone approving a dictatorship.
The point I think in this chapter he's making is that there may be good people who believe that as long as the dictator is a good guy, things will work out. But he's also saying, because of the way that like totalitarianism works, like the prerequisites you need to rise up to the level of dictator, there is actually no way that the dictator will be a good guy. So like good people may be deceived by this notion, but actually there is no quote unquote nice guy dictator.
Yeah, sure.
So, and he gives some reasons for this. I wrote 2 of them down. He names 3, but the second one was like lame, so I didn't write it down.
Wow.
It's page 103 if you want to have a look. But so he says, the dictator needs to accumulate the largest group to impose totalitarian rule. That will be the lowest educated and people with low standards. So he's not necessarily saying that people who are not educated are bad people, but like the lower your standards, the least educated you are, the higher the chance is that you will have like less diversified views. So
I think, and it's also the fact that maybe this was another point you were talking about, but he says this does not mean that the majority of people have low moral standards. It merely means that the largest group of people whose values are very similar are the people with low standards. It is, as it were, the lowest common denominator which unites the largest number of people. So, like, I mean, this makes sense to me because if you look at any kind of political movement of any kind, they tend to rally around messages which don't actually necessarily even track onto like what people further up in the organization will like vouch for, right?
Yeah. So basically, for example, if you want to like look at socialism or national socialism, you could say that, higher wages for workers, more unionization, the working man, the proletariat, the Aryan worker, he is owed a higher standing in society. So many simple people will say, sounds great, I'm in.
Yeah.
But if you like get to, I guess, the more you think about this, quote unquote, the more educated, the more you are, you will actually realize that, well, okay, these are great goals, but it depends on the means of how to get there.
Yeah.
And then you're going to start to split hairs, and that's where we get into the distinguishing between liberals and socialists, national socialists, and all that, right?
Yeah.
So, but at the very base level of like, yeah, higher wages, better conditions, yeah, you're going to probably find like the people with the lowest standards agreeing.
They clearly have the most success. And I mean, this is populism essentially, right?
Yes. And then he also says that the totalitarian leader also needs a common enemy, because it's always easier to argue against something and for something. Mm-hmm. And so it is no coincidence that the Nazis picked the Jew and the Soviets picked the Kulak as their first enemies, because they were like, yeah, it's the spirit of Cain, really, right? It's this guy is more than me.
Yeah.
And so this would be another thing of like the distinction between socialism or communism and fascism is somewhat arbitrary. Mm-hmm. Right. Next point. Collectivism can only work as particularism, not on a world scale. It needs the us versus them dynamic. So this is a point of why socialism will necessarily become nationalism. And if you look at any socialist country ever, this is perfectly obvious. Like you could argue that the Soviet Union became like a big thing, right? But it essentially became like one nation. So like you cannot have a socialist country that is like super open, free trade and all that, right? Like,
right. Sure. Okay.
Because like you're not going to convince, like if it's like an us versus them thing, like proletariat versus bourgeoisie. It's only going to work within like a certain nations where people share a certain identity. You're not going to get like the Soviet proletariat to agree that I know we have very little, but actually we should give half our stuff to Africa.
yeah, sure. So I really like this section because I think the general like the tone and description of like totalitarianism and the authoritarian person is like pretty well like established. Like the whole idea of like the unscrupulous and uninhibited are likely to be more successful in a society tending towards totalitarianism, and this like idea of like totalitarianism being this like kind of like teetering like unstable thing, which is not really which is based on like these emotional ideas which aren't necessarily fully like which are so nebulous and like difficult to really put into something that they never they can't even really be criticized or negated or even measured. And there's a book this reminded me of by a guy called Theodore Adorno called The Authoritarian Personality, which is like an attempt to kind of create a set of criteria to it's Frankfurt School Adorno. It's like a attempt to like create criteria to assess the personality of specific people, how authoritarian they are. I haven't read it, but I've heard a lot about it.
If you want to talk about really like recent developments in psychology, on like personality, Big Five, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So there's I think about like 8-ish studies now, trying to identify what kind of personality traits predict authoritarian like personality, basically. And they actually did find a difference between right-wing and left-wing totalitarianism.
Really?
As it pertains to personality.
Right.
I forgot the exact difference. But I think it's the right-wing totalitarians are characterized by the dark tetrad.
Dark tetrad.
No, the dark triad, and the left wings are characterized by the dark tetrad. So it's like one extra negative personality trait. I think it's like it's Machiavellianism, sadism. Oh, I think it's sadism is the one that is additional to the left wing.
Okay, it says dark triad. After the addition of sadism, it became dark tetrad. Dark tetrad personality traits include narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and sadism.
Yeah, so don't quote me on this, but there are like a couple of studies now which are claiming that there's like a personality difference between totalitarian right and left wingism.
Right. That's interesting.
So yeah, if we have time, might be interesting to read about that sometime.
Yeah.
But these were like the personality dimensions which were excluded from the Big Five originally because they were like too negative.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Okay, so this is really cool. I love this. We talk about Nietzsche, about Zarathustra, and I want you to read this. I remember us reading this part in Zarathustra and theorizing about its meaning. And like the way Hayek connected this, it makes so much sense to me. I love this. So if you could read this paragraph and then the footnote corresponding to it.
I got you. If the community or the state are prior to the individual, if they have ends of their own, independent of and superior to those of the individuals, only those individuals who work for the same ends can be regarded as members of the community. It is a necessary consequence of this view that a person is respected only as a member of the group, that is, only if and insofar as he works for the recognized common ends, and that he derives his whole dignity only from this membership and not merely from being man. Indeed, the very concepts of humanity, and therefore of any form of internationalism, are entirely products of the individualist view of man, and there can be no place for them in a collectivist system of thought. And the citation, the footnote, it is entirely in the spirit of collectivism when Nietzsche makes his Zarathustra say, quote, 1,000 goals have existed hitherto, for 1,000 people existed, but the fetter for the 1,000 next is still lacking. The one goal is still lacking. Humanity has no goal yet. But tell me, I pray, my brethren, if the goal be lacking to humanity, is not humanity itself lacking? End quote. I miss reading Zarathustra, man. It's so good.
Well, we're gonna do part 3. I love it.
That's true.
No, this makes a lot of sense to me. Like the what we consider humanism. The idea that you have value not because you fulfill a certain role in the community, but because you're a human.
Yeah.
kind of natural rights-ish thing, right? Is like it is very much a like individualist Western liberalism idea. And clearly this goes out the window in like a highly collectivized society.
Yeah, right.
Like if you're not like do you have any rights as a human at all? Well, if there's individualism, yes, but if there's collectivism, it's not really.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this connection to their stress. So good. Okay. Because I remember we read this and we couldn't really make sense of it that much.
Right.
I don't know. Tasty.
That's good. I like that. I need to think about that more. Okay, what are we on to next?
Last thing in chapter 10 that I wrote down is the ends justifies the means mantra. So in individual ethics, this would mean the complete denial of all morals. If your ends justify your means, that means there's no morals at all. You can just do anything as long as you have good intentions.
What's the word? Utilitarian approach, right?
How do you mean?
If Utilitarianism doesn't not necessarily concerned
with the extreme utilitarianism.
Yes.
So on an individual level, it means that if your ends justify your means, it just means that as long as your intentions are good, you can do anything you want. You can kill people, rape children. I don't care. But in a collectivist ethics, ends justifies the means is the necessary supreme rule. Just interesting to point out that contrast.
Yeah.
So no wonder you get like quote unquote ordinary people like shooting pregnant women in the head outside a field, like in collective society. Like as long as it's if the goal is grand enough, then you can justify.
It's grander than individual and human value.
I want to read the book Ordinary Men.
It's interesting.
At some point.
It's a very interesting thing, actually. So we have this idea that a society that's working towards a common goal, insofar as that goal does not allow for individual diversion away from that, it will necessarily lead to the project being valued over the people who are part of that project itself.
Yeah, and he talks about...
It does explain, like we talked about earlier, like selling your, reporting your parents to the Gestapo or whatever.
And he talks about how in a collectivist society, people can only have useful habits, no morals. So useful habits means like...
I like this, sorry, go on.
Yeah, a useful habit would, for example, be to, be effective in your work, be dedicated, be conscientious, do your job well, be orderly. Whereas morals would be things like fairness or justice and care about the downtrodden. You can't have any quality that could potentially have a conflict with the collective goal. So any qualities that you would praise in someone in a collective society would never be you have good morals or you have good aims.
Yeah.
You can only have quote unquote good habits, right?
Yeah. And this connects, I'm not sure if this is the next chapter or not, but the idea of the totalitarian thought on when it comes to any kind of activity develops to the point where you don't think for the sake of thinking. You don't create art for the sake of creating art. You don't do science for the sake of doing science. You don't play chess for the sake of playing chess. You're doing all of these activities for the sake of the state and the sake of that project, right? And sometimes you see it's really clear when you look at political programming on YouTube and whatever, or just anywhere. People were very, very explicit about it. It'd be we want to look at this from this lens. This channel looks at this thing from this lens, and it's very, very explicitly part of a political project. And
try to get funding for your research on the nut collecting habits of the American squirrel. No. Try to get funding for your nut collecting habits of the American squirrel in relation to climate change. Approved. Approved.
Are you going to say in relation to gender? It's just going to slap you.
No, I mean it does point. Sorry, go.
No. Go ahead.
It does point out so. For example, this is the issue with quote unquote public property, which I think is kind of an annoying oxymoron. But how do we decide how to direct or tax funds, right? So I get pretty annoyed when we have classes in university where the professors just go on about what cat cafe they went to recently and completely waste everyone's time. And that is because of the very same reason that socialists would say chess has to be in relation to the party, right? That is to say that if you're going to use our public resources for this, you're going to have to demonstrate some kind of merit in what you're doing. You can't just do what you're doing for the sake of doing it because you like doing it. if you're going to use public resources for it, you're going to have to demonstrate why this is useful for the community.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I actually agree with that point. But the conclusion is not that we should have everything directed by public resources and everything in relation to the party. My conclusion is that we should have less things directed by public resources. And actually, it is pretty fucking awesome that you do things for the sake of doing things, but you're going to have to do those with your own funds or with funds that people voluntarily gave you, right?
Yeah, and I think there's because one thing that I've been thinking a lot about recently is like community and how to, I don't know, not necessarily how to like create community, but the problems around creating community and the problems that community faces. And it was inspired by this really interesting video that I watched about like strategies to basically like increase public health in residential areas and basically make places more interesting to live in. And what was super interesting about it was that wait, how am I relating this back?
Doing things for the sake of it?
Yes. So this guy basically sketched out this plan for a living space where people are it's like a block basically of like an American suburb. You know, it's normally just like a grid and it looks like dog shit.
Yeah.
And thinking about ways of like basically creating like shared spaces, then creating like shared kind of like areas and making the place more interesting to walk around and live in, and just like, I don't know, in a way to basically improve people's like well-being essentially around that space. And for an individual, like I think people actually do get a lot out of when they are in the position to do so. They get a lot out of like contributing to the community in that sense. And like, so whilst we're criticizing this idea of doing arts for the sake of the state or whatever, this is kind of different. But doing something for the sake of your community, you see these like old women and old dudes like walking around cleaning up rubbish in the parks and stuff, even though they're not like employed to do it.
Right.
But it's like a sense of some kind of sense of shared, like a share of the responsibility of the space, or wanting to make the place better for other people in a kind of a selfless way.
And I think that's awesome, and that's actually not at all in contradiction to libertarianism or anything like that.
Yeah, no, right? It's not. That's the thing. And it would be allowed to. It wouldn't be permitted from happening. It would happen spontaneously. And I actually have a theory, which I haven't fully like elaborated, but I think actually Japan would be uniquely good for like a lefty anarchist, like
I agree.
Syndicates, like
I totally agree.
It would. It's definitely had that cultural, like it's moved away from it, but there's lots of places where you can still see that today.
Cool.
Which I think is super interesting. The idea that like a strong kind of cultural tendency towards like some kind of cultural behaviors can actually make possible some forms of government that are completely impossible in other places around the world, or seem to be impossible.
Okay, so chapter 11, you already talked about some of it, but he says totalitarian propaganda must undermine truth. I think that it's pretty obvious. We don't really have to dissect this, but I think it's like, what is it? Like a Peterson talking point of like, in a totalitarian state, everyone lies to everybody all the time, which we find reflected here. Right, he talks about the perversion of language and how words are completely inverted.
He says as he uses the word socialism
in the most coherent way that you could probably use it. Freedom redefined as power, right? Socialist philosophers have paved this way. Things are not, they don't just change their meaning, they actually become the opposite of what they used to mean. Right, and then totalitarianism despises abstract thought. So the party and math in Nazi Germany and Soviet ideology.
I love that,
yeah. So, quote, material circumstances, class, oh, not quote, actually. I wrote this down. Paraphrase. Material circumstances, class, race, etc. determine thought, and there is no real freedom of thought unless we consciously direct it. It's like a totalitarian claim, which is then used to say that, yeah, we can't have just math in the abstract, we need math in relation to the party.
Yeah.
Because, you know, your material circumstances, your class actually shape, like, math is like a relic of all these things, which, like, I mean, do I have to bring up, like, modern day America of, like, math is racist, math is white supremacy, logic is racist, freedom of speech is racist. It's the same thing. There's only so many ideas in the world, and we're starting to repeat them. Okay. Chapter 11. Any comments?
Let me see. What have we got?
It's page 122. The material circumstances thing.
No, I think I mean my main points were about the secular state. All right, let's go to the next chapter 12.
Chapter 12.
The socialist roots of Nazism. All anti-liberal forces are combining against everything that is liberal.
Quote, socialists of the left approached more and more to those of the right. It was the union of anti-capitalist forces of the right and the left which drove out from Germany everything that was liberal. And then we have a footnote talking about how the German Social Democrat Party... Right, oh, yeah, this, okay, I want you, this one. So, yeah. So, quote, in 1892, one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, August Bebel, was able to tell Bismarck that the imperial chancellor can rest assured that German social democracy is a sort of preparatory school for militarism. Right, and then he talks about how all these socialist academics and professors and intellectuals turned national socialists real quick, because it's really not much of a change there. We were talking about Professor Werner Sombart, who is a Marxist who turned Nazi. The German War, right? Yeah. So there's this idea in socialism before even Hitler came in of that there is this war between Germany and England, which is inevitable, and that Germany represents the progress of society, socialism, and that England represents liberalism, and kind of this thing that has to be overcome. Yeah, capitalism in Marxist theory necessarily, ends in socialism, right? So the war against commercialism, which prioritizes individual over collective, is inevitable. And there's a lot of vilification of the English comfort. That is like, I think he talks about the English soldiers in the trenches having safety razors.
Yes, yeah, he does mention that.
So just a lot of this like anti-capitalist, anti-commercialist stuff, which really united the right and left-wing socialists in Germany.
It's hard for me to comment. I mean, I'm not like... It would be good to look more into the history. It does seem significant, though, that like... I mean, the Nazis were like quite explicitly anti-communist. So even though...
But to the degree that they were anti-Russia, right? Like they had to seize a land to take it from them, right? Like and the reason...
Not even necessarily... I mean, I guess you could say anti-Russia,
like
but...
The reason why, at least Hayek gives this, the reason why socialists and National Socialists clashed in Germany, because they were competing for the same kind of mind. Right. Whereas liberalism was completely absent. There was no real reason to fight liberalism, because the liberals will be driven out, like, or like indoctrinated or whatever. Like you're not going to win over a liberal if you're a socialist or a nationalist socialist. But because these doctrines are actually almost the same, there was a lot of competition between those two.
I see what you're saying, right?
To win over this, they're addressing the same kind of people, the workers who are downtrodden and who are owed more because the Jew or the kulak or the bourgeoisie or the Soviets or the Russians or the Bolsheviks or whatever, because they took away what they are naturally owed from the world. And we talk about Mr. Plenger. Right, so there was this... I don't know if this is worth reading. It's quite a long quote, but he quotes very... he quotes a lot from this guy's books called Plenger. What is it? Johann? Shit, I lost. I don't know.
Plenger, Johann, shit, I lost.
That guy, Plenger. Anyway, he was a Marxist professor who rationalized Hitler's New Order, race superiority of the state over individual, etc., based on socialism throughout his writings. And yeah, he talks. This is not just an isolated incident. This was basically the intellectual culture in Germany at the time. So we have here one quote that the war economy in Germany in 1914 is, quote, the first realization of a socialist society, quote, Plinger. And yeah, German scientists and engineers call for organization, quoted Oswald. And yeah, socialist planners end up on Göring's 5-year plan commission admission staff. So I think this is even more extreme in Italy under Mussolini than in Germany, where literally the Socialist Party, literally the same people became the National Socialists.
Right.
In Germany, there's a little less overlap, but yeah. Like the kind of socialists or communists that would get persecuted in Germany were those fighting for the ends, not the means. So those would be your utopians who say, democratic international socialism, equality of all people, Africans, blah 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 blah.
Yeah,
like people who had no real sense for how to implement that. Whereas your realist socialists talking about the means of state authority and so on, they were absorbed by the National Socialist movement. Another professor, Lensch, also a Marxist, spent most of his life on detailing Marx and Hegel's philosophy. Says that the English-German War is the flight of the English bourgeoisie from the advance of socialism. And yeah, Germany is revolutionary in world history, whereas England is the counter-revolutionary. So, yeah, liberals would argue from the English side of individualism, and they're the real enemy of socialism. And another assertion by this guy is that the old Prussian spirit and socialist conviction is the same. That is planning, basically, right?
Right. Okay.
And these are all Marxist intellectuals saying this. Then there's this other guy, Spengler. I don't know if he was a Marxist, actually, but he said liberalism is despised in Germany. Okay, I see.
I mean, we're just going through quotes at this point, right?
Yeah.
I think we can move on.
I have this point that I want you to read, though.
Okay.
It's from the German to in the two countries. All right, can you just read from here to here? The German.
The German, more correctly Prussian instinct is, the power belongs to the whole. Everyone is given his place. One commands or obeys. This is, since the 18th century, authoritarian socialism, essentially illiberal and anti-democratic insofar as English liberalism and French democracy are meant. There are in Germany many hated and ill-reputed contrasts, but liberalism alone is contemptible on German soil. The structure of the English nation is based on the distinction between rich and poor, that of the Prussian on that between command and obedience. The meaning of class distinction is accordingly fundamentally different in the two countries.
Yeah, so there has been certainly like a intellectual tradition in Germany against the kind of English commercialism, which paved the way for the totalitarian, we can call it planning if you don't want to call it socialism, but yeah, this kind of overthrowing of free enterprise. And then there was one more quote on this. There are no two large enemy. Oh, this one. So this is a guy. Oh, this is like a big Nazi fucking spokesperson. Von der Bruck.
There are no liberals in Germany today. There are young revolutionaries. There are young conservatives. But who would be a liberal? Liberalism is a philosophy of life from which German youth now turns with nausea, with wrath, with quite peculiar scorn, for there is none more foreign, more repugnant, more opposed to its philosophy. German youth today recognizes the liberal as the arch enemy.
And then Hayek goes on to talk about how the German socialist youth spearheads this fusion of socialism and National Socialism. I think, again, like talking about this whole business administration thing, this is somewhat still present in Germany. So there's, I mean, it's to some degree present in all Western countries, but there is like a very distinguished dislike of profit motive of free enterprise in Germany, and like a romanticization of civil servancy. Like the like free FDP, the like Free Democratic Party, which stands for like kind of more like free marketism.
Yeah.
Is like is very, very much disliked and has very, very few voters. Yeah, this is just like the common thing, and like all other parties kind of disagree, kind of agree that, you know, we may disagree on what like ends we want to direct government funding to, but at least we're not those fucking free market capitalist pigs.
Right.
Okay, we can move on if you want.
Yes. Cool. Chapter 13.
Yes, I have some
The
points.
totalitarians in our midst. I don't think I have many notes on this.
Yes, he's talking about totalitarian movement in England at the time. So, yeah, he points out that socialists are against free trade, which quote-unquote only served the special interests of England. Page 140. So yeah, definitely this disagreement of free trade kind of saying, you know, it's kind of the same thing with free speech, but I think free trade more egregiously, where the left always argues that the benefits from free trade are not equal, and that free trade only benefits the rich world, and that free trade is exploitation of the African countries, and that the reason why Africa is still poor is because of free trade and exploitation and the Western countries, blah blah blah. Yeah, economically, obviously, does not hold up, but yeah, it's kind of, and then, you know, socialists in England would argue for imitating Hitler's model of restricted trade. So yeah, this is just kind of like a little reminder of like, yeah, look at who's against free trade today and on what grounds, and be suspicious. Again, so he talks about scientists and engineers submitting to planning more easily in Nazi Germany, and especially the natural scientists are more inclined for fascism than the humanities and social sciences.
Right, yeah.
And so he talks about this in like a, you know, according to the scientist worldview, we can organize and plan everything perfectly, and we can like calculate all these things.
Technocracy kind of
style. Yes. I think, interestingly enough, today it's the opposite.
You think today is not a technocracy?
No, I think today social sciences and humanities are much more socialist, central plannerist, fascist than the natural sciences.
You think so?
Yes. I mean, if you just look at like political orientation of like university staff, that it's like borne out very clearly from what is it? Jonathan Haidt.
Political orientation on like what measure? Like left versus right, or what?
Just like extreme political views. Like, would you consider yourself a socialist? Would you consider yourself a communist? Like much more in the social sciences and humanities than in the.
I mean, I think that makes. I don't know if that would necessarily translate to actually being authoritarian. Because I mean, like, what do you study? You don't study. You will never come across the word communism in the natural sciences.
Sure, but at the time this was the opposite in Germany, right? So at the time the German, like, or even like the English scientists, you know, intellectual class was more so like, if we can only get the power to calculate all the needs of everyone, then we can perfectly direct the economy, and socialism is the natural consequence. And it goes into this whole thing of Marxism being like a scientific methodology. Right?
Yeah, but I think it might not be. I mean, it's definitely not the case that scientific Marxism is definitely not like advocated for today. But I would still say that like
it is in the social sciences.
In terms of like talking about like this having this technical knowledge and this idea that we can perfectly distribute like materials from as a scientist. I don't think there are people who are like promoting that idea necessarily, but what I will say is that like people who are in the natural sciences have literally no fucking clue about political theory, and
they're much more apolitical. Yeah,
I wouldn't say necessarily apolitical. I would say that a lot of people have very, very, very simplistic solutions for what they think is right, which tend towards, could tend towards like
true, and this is where we get into this like experts being focused on their thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So his point still holds up to some degree today.
I do think there is, I'm not going to disagree that in the humanities people tend to be left, because I think that's generally true. But I would also say that the education affords at least a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of things like political philosophy and like what totalitarianism might mean.
It kind of depends, right? I think in England, the English humanities are fairly well preserved, like especially the good in like Oxford and so on. There's still like a lot of people doing like legit, the literary canon of Shakespeare and of Mill, and like people are still interested in these canonical texts. And there's actually a lot of pushback in England and in France as well from the humanities against like wokeism and that kind of stuff. But in like North America, like it seems a bit more worrying that the like literary canon of humanities it's basically all like patriarchy, old white men bad, and we should all do away with it. That seems to be the consensus in the humanities in North America.
I don't know. I don't think. I mean, it would make sense that America is less involved in like the literary, like the quote unquote canon, right? Yeah, I don't know.
All right. One more point on this chapter.
This was a long chapter.
The socialist/fascist hate of Western individualism, capitalism, etc., is the hatred of almost everything which distinguishes European civilization since the Renaissance. Is combined with an approval of the... Oh, this is a quote. That's why it's so hard to read. Jesus Christ. Okay. Quote. Hatred of almost everything which distinguishes European civilization since the Renaissance is combined with an approval of the methods of the Inquisition. So, yeah, while the methods of the Inquisition, that is like this very totalitarian thing, is lauded, where at the same time, what is it called? Denouncing like Eurocentralism, basically, you would say today.
Sorry, I wasn't listening to that.
You were opening the fucking door.
I just unlocked the secret of making this room colder.
Yeah, I hope the fucking Kanki-sen is not on the audio. Whatever. So
I'm sorry.
So yeah. So he's just making a point that, you know, socialists and fascists united in their hate of European civilization since the Renaissance. Right. And, you know, this, again, I would ask you, who today is decrying Eurocentrism as bad? Those are the bad people.
Mm.
Those are the people who, because Eurocentrism basically stands for liberalism, for individualism, for freedom of speech, for all these things, which the enemies would say that they're all just relics of power dynamics of the white male and so on. And I think this is why Zizek is such a reasonable, even though he's extreme, and very cool socialist, is because he just comes out and says, I'm a Eurocentrist. Of course I'm a Eurocentrist. Are you insane? He's like, yes, individualism, yes, democracy, yes, freedom of speech. Like,
yeah.
He doesn't play these games, which is why he's so fucking baller. So Hayek says the hatred of everything which has distinguished European civilization since the Renaissance. The modern term for this is Eurocentrism.
Mm.
And, you know, really what Hayek and I guess also people today would be pointing at is kind of the classical liberal 19th century European tradition of individualism, market-oriented capitalism, free expression, those kind of values, right?
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, obviously, like, cultural colonialism is bad, but the critics of Eurocentrism are usually not attacking that. In fact, they are actually the cultural colonialists trying to import their ideologies on other cultures while hating on Eurocentrism.
Mm.
And the best example of this is like leftists going to like extremely poor countries and telling them that they need to meet their renewable energy quotas.
Does that happen?
Yeah, oh, we can talk for 20 hours about this. Anyway, last point on chapter 13.
Maybe 20 more hours.
Maybe 3 episodes. Organized labor and organized capital striving for monopolistic organization of industry is leading towards totalitarianism. So he's talking about Nazi Germany.
This is 14 now, sorry.
Chapter 13, the last bit. So he's talking about, organized labor and organized capital. So labor unions and like crony capitalist, syndicalist type guys,
mm-hmm.
lobbying for government support and trying to like gain a little slice of monopoly.
Yeah.
Whether consciously or unconsciously. I think the best modern day example for this again is minimum wage laws, where you have both labor unions as well as Amazon, big business, lobbying for minimum wage laws.
Right.
Why is that? Because
they know that smaller companies can't pay that.
So basically they're lobbying, as Hayek also puts it, for a kind of slice of monopoly.
Right.
So it's this whole thing of like, if we can use government planning to get a little share of the pie, then we'll be better off than the other ones.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, minimum wage law is great for the people who are employed in that job, but for the people who are unemployed, and especially the unskilled ones, and maybe don't speak the language, it's going to be a lot harder now to get that job. It's this different interest groups lobbying for a little slice of planning, which then aggravates the demand for total planning, right?
Mm.
Okay, chapter 14. Almost there, guys. 2 more chapters.
1 more hour. There was another thing I just wanted to say before that.
No!
I was going to say the idea of syndicates. Is normally like, today like anarcho-syndicalism, and which is part of this like left libertarian libertarianism ideal of like worker cooperatives is, in a way, kind of also what's the word? It's often like proposed as this like great solution where, you know, we get this solution where workers have responsibility of their labour. We can do it, and maybe we can try and find a way of doing it in some means that is less coercive than others. But the whole, one of the main ideas of like behind this is that we want to like reduce inequality, but in fact, when you have a bunch of different syndicates, you really just have a bunch of different like kind of semi-unaccountable, kind of half private organizations, which people will be very competitively try to get into to get benefits, which will basically reproduce the same kind of inequalities.
It's very much modern Chinese economy, I think.
Really?
I mean, you have like certain companies who are given like a favored role by the government, even in South Korea to some extent.
Well, in anarcho-syndicalism there would be like little to no government.
Well, yeah, I don't mean anarcho-syndicalism, but yeah, like the what you mean of like these semi-private interest groups where it's really hard to get into, but they're like lobbying for the little slice of planning, and yeah.
I mean, public universities in Japan as well to an extent.
Yeah, right? For sure. Although those are at least fairly meritocratic. As to their admission.
It's different, yeah.
Okay, so chapter 14. I like this part. We've talked about this topic on a different episode, I think. As Milton said, if every action which is good or evil in a man, ripe of years, were under pittance and prescription and compulsion, what were virtue but a name? What praise should then be due to well-doing? What gramercy to be sober, just, or content? Well, I don't know if I said that word right, but this is one of my favorite talking points because it's such a silver bullet against Christian conservatism. That is to say that there's this idea in Christianity that, you know, the reason why there's sin and all these evil things on the world is because, you know, God put humans in the world, and, you know, you have to at least have the choice to act evil, right?
Yeah.
Because you have the freedom to choice to act good, you can be rewarded for being a good person, and that means that there is something as morality. And then, you know, but again, when this is applied to the state, all of a sudden, a lot of Christian conservatives have this conception of, yeah, we have to actually not just advise morality, we have to coerce morality.
Yeah.
Which then, it's not morality, I'm sorry, you're just following orders at that point.
Yeah.
Very like this one.
I need to find that quote.
The one I just read?
Yeah, I don't have the page.
157, it's on this one.
For every action which is good or evil in a man of ripe years, were under pittance and prescription and compulsion. Yeah. What were virtue but a name? What praise should then be due to well-doing? What gramercy to be sober, just, or continent?
The fuck is gramercy?
I don't know. What's continent?
Name a continent. Southeast England. Oh god, I'm losing it.
We're close.
Socialism is of course anti-moral, as its objective is to abdicate responsibility, page 157, same page. Then we have the omelet quote I read at the beginning.
Oh god, this is like a fucking descent into madness. This is gonna be like lost media. So it's gonna end up like posted on 4chan in like 10 years.
Oh no.
Some creepypasta.
8chan.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else from this in your notes?
I want you to read a thing.
Okay.
I really like how this chapter ends. The last paragraph. If we are
to succeed in the war of ideologies and to win over the decent elements in the enemy countries, We must first of all regain the belief in the traditional values for which this country stood in the past, and must have the moral courage stoutly to defend the ideals which our enemies attack. Not by shamefaced apologies and by assurances that we are rapidly reforming, not by explaining that we are seeking some compromise between the traditional English values and the new totalitarian ideas, shall we win confidence and support. Not the latest improvements we may have effected in our social institutions, which count but little compared with the basic differences of two opposed ways of life, but our unwavering faith in those traditions, which have made this country a country of free and upright, tolerant and independent people, is the thing that counts.
Oof. So yeah, sexy quote. If we're talking about like the quote unquote culture war, there's always how do we win over the other side, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And I think an unfortunate misstep of kind of right wing conservative populism nowadays is to try and distance themselves from quote unquote Eurocentrism, but also adopt this thing of planning of. You see it a bit with Trump going against free trade, and it's a bit more nuanced than that. But kind of renouncing the liberal values that Western civilization was founded on, and instead trying to use the socialist means or the planning means to simply for their own right wing ends.
Yeah, right.
That's not how it should be gone about. If you want to really conserve the civilization, right? If you're really a conservative who wants to conserve the Western liberal civilization, that's not how you should go about it.
Yeah, fair point.
Last chapter. Wow, we're here, guys.
We did it. This is quite an interesting little kind of addition, I guess. It's not. It's kind of, he admits that it's not fully.
Yeah, I thought it kind of repetitive.
Yeah, it's not fully kind of written, explained, but it's about international order. Most of it is him, like you said, just repeating like
same things on the national scale.
Kind of and it's like you spent all this time saying how a strong state within a national border is bad. I'm gonna assume that on the international scale it is worse. You don't have to say this like 20 fucking times.
Yeah.
Especially when you're like close to the end of the book and you're like, come on, let's go. But he does make good points. One of them is that I mentioned earlier. It is as follows. It is neither necessary nor desirable that national boundaries should mark sharp differences in standards of living, that membership of a national group should entitle one to a share in a cake altogether different from that in which members of other groups share. And, I mean, it speaks, I guess, to, like, general altruism, but also the ideas of, like, free trade, allowing countries to actually be useful to one another. And... yeah, I don't know. This was a nice thing. I like this.
Yeah, when it comes to a lot of those like differences, I mean, there's a billion things that we can talk about in the differences of wealth between nations. But I think one big reason that Hayek, earlier he said money is one of those things that needs to be state regulated. Whereas I think, the current global order of currency is one of the things that's really justifying differences in standard of living and so on. Is this world order of the US dollar and all these exchange rates.
Right.
And how governments print money with inflation and manipulate exchange rates to their own benefit.
Right.
This has such a long history. There's a book called Money Mischief by Milton Friedman, which I read recently. Talks all about like different manipulations of currency. And one point was that when America adopted the gold standard was kind of a big political debate in the US, whether they should or not. and Europeans were doing it, and it was like, should America follow? And China at the time had the silver standard, actually had a bimetalist standard of both gold and silver. So what happened then is that as the US adopted the gold standard, the international balance was offset so hard that the Chinese silver, like the value of silver dropped so immensely in China that China kind of spiraled into this like economic recession, which then eventually, like a lot of economic deprivation, build up frustration, led to the communist rise in China.
Right.
So what Milton Friedman is getting at, like these kind of international money manipulations, you there is like a way to look at this where you can say, because America adopted the gold standard, communism succeeded in China.
Right, okay.
And yes, like I totally agree that like, and he talks about federalism, right? That there should be like an international federation. Like that gets so tricky in the details with how to work out money, and I think that's such a big part of the economic argument, especially if you look at the EU, which works in many ways, and the euro has many benefits.
Yeah.
But one of the things that the European Central Bank has done is, like, same as in Japan, completely obliterated the interest rate, so that, like, you know, we have all this issue with money to Greece and blah blah blah, but at like bottom line, there's no more interest on savings in Europe now. Right. And like, I don't know, this is just driving a lot of the inequalities, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. There also just tends, like, sense there seems to be there seems to be, like, maybe I haven't read closely enough, but like a general kind of like sense that I mean, understanding of the arbitrarity of national borders, and maybe like the possibility of I don't know how to say this, but like, I mean, it's against nationalism, it seems, slightly, and maybe you could also connect it to like Weimar Germany having, I mean, nationalism developing out of this, like, this shame which was contained within the border of Germany of having had to pay reparations for this war, versus you know, which was also like which was, it was a punishment that was dished out by America and Britain, maybe, I don't know who.
Punishment against
Weimar Germany.
Yeah.
And how even just generally these strong conceptions of borders and like of like people who belong to different places can create the conditions for totalitarian states to rise up. Right? These like conceptual ideas of us as different people. I mean, and then we talk about at the beginning of the book, you know, is there something about German people that makes them totalitarian? Like that whole idea as well, right? Kind of feeds maybe into the same thing.
Which, you know, and Hayek, his correct analysis of this point is not that, oh, we shouldn't hate Germans because that's racist, blah, blah, blah. That's not actually the main danger of that.
Yeah.
The main danger is if we fail to identify that the reason Germany became what it became is central planning and not some innate Germanness, we will also succumb to the temptation of central planning.
Right.
That's why it's dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, racism is bad or whatever, but like the main reason for him was,
I see what you're
we
saying,
have to correctly identify the root of National Socialism.
I see what you're saying, right. Cool.
Okay, one quote from the last chapter. We shall never prevent the abuse of power if we are not prepared to limit power in a way which occasionally may also prevent its use for desirable purposes. Just a nice little quote that you can put at the beginning of your PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, sometimes you can maybe use state power to do something good, but you know, you have to think not in a specific instance, but on the whole. Will having the state having this power over the next 50 years, will that enable more good than bad?
Yeah.
Not, can I possibly use this for a good thing?
Yes.
Okay,
cool.
And
All right.
in the conclusion, he closes us out with.
Yeah.
I think I like this insight, which is young people are right in rejecting their elders' values. However, there are not any more. They, being the values, are not anymore the liberal ideals of the 19th century, which the young generation hardly knows. I see so much of that in the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Right.
You have a lot of young people protesting against quote-unquote capitalism, against quote-unquote Western values, against liberalism, when really the capitalists, the liberals, they agree with the same thing that the Occupy Wall Street people agree with, which is against crony capitalism, which is planning introduced into capitalism, which is the government giving a little slice of monopoly to like a syndicalist or whatever, right? So what they find objectionable is the perversion of liberalism by collectivists and planners, not liberalism itself.
Cool book, man. That's yeah.
Yeah. Of course there's lots I don't agree with, but I think this is like, I mean, it's no Nobel Prize winner, so
yeah,
definitely worth a read.
It was very, I got a lot from talking about it as well, for sure. There's like a lot of things that are quite...
It's a bike, don't worry.
Shit. They're coming for me. The planners. They want to plan me.
Yeah. So I think like if we want to make our political discourse today a bit more, a little less explosive and a bit more reasonable, we should use the word central planning instead of socialism.
Yeah.
Which I think Hayek has correctly identified that it means the same. But because of the different nuances that we have with socialism today, it's often not useful to say socialism because it's not clear what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, I think it's also like, well, from this like this this perspective that he like creates, this like what's the word? This kind of like map that he draws of it's not left and right, but it's and like a center, but it's rather liberalism and then tracking down to authoritarianism of any kind, almost without like distinction. I think I don't know, like it gives you a much more like concrete thing to attack if you actually, and it kind of like shows to whoever you're talking with that you have no principal objection necessarily to that, whatever ideology they have or whatever they think their ideology is associated with.
To their ends, right?
Yeah, their ends for sure. So, and I do think that in a way that is like the kind of foot in the door of libertarianism, of like, which is very much kind of like focused on the ends, and obviously like critical of government in any way, right? I mean, it's interesting when we talk about like, when I speak to a lot of my friends, and really, I mean, anyone, there's, most of my friends are like left-leaning, and
well, they were educated by the government.
I mean, a lot of my friends have pretty well thought out values.
I just think that
You fucking shit. My main... Well, I forgot what I was going to say. My fucking brain is fried. You fucked me.
Ends. The different ends.
The different ends. I gotta get off the Zaza, man.
Like, if you want to make a very abstract and general lesson from this book, away from socialism and so on, I think it would be to seriously think about what kind of means would be necessary to implement the ends that you're lobbying for, and whether your particularly political ideology would in effect be different from something that you oppose in its means.
I think also, being able to because most both like far left and far right, I think have very strong criticisms of government when it concerns what their ultimate, their ideology prescribes. But to maybe ask people to imagine if the goals that they were looking for, the specific kind of things that they wanted, were to be carried out by the worst possible government they can imagine, which would be to them on the other side. It's imagine trying to ask the Nazi government to install anti-hate speech laws or something,
right?
And it's I can't imagine that happening. So you often see with the most people are very supportive of the NHS. I mean, me too, of course. But
of course, they're listening.
No, I mean, but then also it's can we be critical of what am I saying? It's very easy to be critical of government when it's with something that you disagree with. But when it's trying to do something that you do agree with, it's much more difficult to levy the same extreme criticism or to kind of even think of it in the same way. And this is the thing which a libertarian would solve with being let's call the whole thing off. We don't need this anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly have my number of totalitarian fantasies of things that I socially disagree with, but would policy-wise allow. But,
yeah.
If I was the dictator.
Thank you for everyone, all of you who have definitely listened this far.
It's fine, it's episode 2.
Episode 2.
All right.
Next time, Zizek, right? Sublime Object of Ideology.
Yes, Slavoj Žižek, the sublime object of ideology.
Right. Peace, love, for all eternity, or else.
Or else.
Boys.